The room felt completely still, the kind of silence that usually comes right after something shatters on a wooden floor. The sharp sound of Mrs. Eleanor Vance's voice was still bouncing off the high ceilings of the dining room in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. "Natalia, get up from that chair right now," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but heavy enough to hold the attention of every person at the table. "And Arthur, don't you dare refer to your wife as just an invited guest in front of the woman you are actively trying to embarrass in her own home." Natalia froze. Her hand was halfway to her glass, fingers barely touching a white linen napkin embroidered with a dark navy blue V. Across the polished mahogany table, Arthur turned toward his grandmother. His neck was red, his jaw clamped shut in that stubborn way he always did when he was caught doing something he knew he shouldn't be doing. Nobody else moved. Arthur's uncle, two of his cousins, the corporate lawyer from the family firm, and two old friends of the family who had known Arthur since he was playing Little League, all sat there with their silver forks suspended above their plates. A dinner that was supposed to be a calm Sunday evening at the old Vance estate had suddenly turned into a full family trial. Down at the far end of the long table, near the heavy oak doors that led out toward the kitchen, Sarah sat in the folding chair the staff had brought in just 10 minutes earlier. She didn't cry, she didn't yell, she didn't even look up at Natalia or Arthur. She just kept her eyes on the plate in front of her, her hands resting quietly in her lap. And somehow, that silence from Sarah made the whole scene 10 times harder for everyone else to stomach. "Grandma, you are making a mountain out of a molehill," Arthur said, dropping his tone real low like he could somehow smooth things over before the servants came back into the room with the coffee. "Natalia is our guest tonight. Sarah said herself that she didn't mind sitting down there." Eleanor looked at him over the rims of her reading glasses. For 40 years, that exact look had made bank managers, county commissioners, and real estate developer groups shut their mouths and rethink their positions. She pointed a thin, age-spotted finger at the plush, armless dining chair directly to Arthur's right, the chair where Sarah had sat for every single family meal over the last 6 years. "If it's just a chair, Arthur," Eleanor said softly, "then why did you feel the need to move your wedded wife out of it, just to sit that woman next to you?" Arthur opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Natalia slowly withdrew her hand from the napkin, her fingernails scraping softly against the cloth. Sarah looked up for the very first time, her gray-green eyes clear and quiet. To understand how a woman like Sarah, who had helped build that house's warm spirit over 6 long years, had ended up sitting by the kitchen door without putting up a fight, you had to look back 3 months earlier to a humid Thursday morning in early summer. 3 months before that Sunday dinner, Sarah was still waking up every morning in the high-ceilinged bedroom she shared with Arthur in their home just outside Knoxville. But for weeks, it had felt like waking up beside a total stranger. The house was still the same house she had designed room by room. The linen drapes she had ordered from North Carolina hung by the tall windows. The framed photograph from their small wedding in the Blue Ridge Mountains sat on the bedside table. And the heavy silver mantel clock Eleanor had given them as a wedding gift still ticked away near the fireplace. Yet Arthur had changed in ways that were too subtle to call him out on, but too persistent to ignore. He came home after midnight, took showers before coming to bed, and kept his phone face down on the nightstand, even when he walked downstairs to get a glass of ice water. If Sarah asked about his day, he gave her short, rehearsed answers about corporate expansion, land acquisitions in Nashville, and meetings with regional investors. If she tried to sit near him, his phone would ring with an urgent work call he just had to take in the study. They didn't argue. That was the worst part. They didn't even have enough real connection left between them to start a decent fight. Sarah had met Arthur when he was 30 years old, long before he became the man whose face appeared in the East Tennessee business journals. Back then, he was running a small branch of the Vance family's timber and real estate operation, and he used to get red in the face whenever someone introduced him as the future heir to the family trust. Sarah was working at a regional interior design studio, living a quiet, grounded life in a small rented house near the river. Arthur used to tell her that he loved how little she cared about his family's money or his last name. During the first 2 years of their marriage, Sarah kept her job, taking on residential projects throughout the county. But as Arthur took on more responsibilities within the main corporation, he asked her to step back. He told her he needed a wife who could be present at dinners, charity galas, and board functions, someone who knew every member of the family, someone who could help him keep the peace during complicated corporate gatherings. Sarah agreed to reduce her workload, thinking it was just a temporary sacrifice for their shared future. 6 years later, almost nobody in Arthur's circle remembered that she had ever had a career of her own before becoming Mrs. Arthur Vance. The first concrete proof came on a warm afternoon in May. Arthur was preparing for a 3-day business trip to Atlanta to oversee a new commercial development. Sarah didn't usually pack his bags, but that afternoon the housekeeper had left early to visit her daughter, so Sarah took it upon herself to fold his dark navy blazer, the one he always wore for high-level dinner meetings. As she lifted the jacket from the hanger, she felt something stiff in the interior breast pocket. She wasn't looking for secrets. She didn't even feel suspicious at first. She assumed it was a parking receipt or a business card and started to toss it onto the desk. Then her eyes caught the bold letterhead at the top of the paper. It was a reservation confirmation for an oceanfront resort in Savannah, Georgia, for a weekend when Arthur had explicitly told her he was locked in negotiations with a team of bankers from Charlotte. The confirmation listed 2 guests, Arthur Vance and Natalia Cruz. Sarah stood completely still beside the open closet for a long time. She didn't scream, and she didn't feel the sudden burst of rage she had always assumed women felt in those moments. What settled over her was something far colder. A slow, quiet realization that 100 small, confusing details from the past 6 months were suddenly sliding into place. The unfamiliar perfume on his collar 3 weeks ago. The late-night text messages he deleted the second she walked into his office. The expensive silk scarf he brought back from a trip to Charleston, handed to her in an airport bag as if he'd remembered her existence 5 minutes before boarding his flight home. She read the reservation twice, folded the paper back along its original creases, and placed it back into the interior pocket of the navy coat. When Arthur came home that evening, he found his suitcase neatly packed by the bedroom door, and Sarah sitting quietly by the window with a book in her lap. "Everything set for tomorrow?" he asked, unbuckling his watch and setting it on the dresser. "Yes," Sarah said, her voice entirely calm. "Your navy jacket is right on top." Arthur looked at her for a moment, perhaps checking her face for something unusual, but her expression was entirely peaceful. During dinner, he talked about Atlanta, about a group of commercial brokers from North Carolina, and about a dinner meeting scheduled for Saturday night that would likely run late. Sarah listened to every word. Each lie was delivered with such easy, practiced smoothness that it hurt her far more than the piece of paper in his coat pocket ever could. She realized then that Arthur wasn't just having an affair. He had reached a point where he could look her straight in the eye, tell her a story built entirely on air, and walk away, feeling completely unbothered. The next morning, shortly after Arthur left for the airport, Sarah's phone rang. It was Eleanor Vance. The family matriarch wanted to see her out at the main Vance estate, a large stone house built on 80 acres of rolling hills outside Oak Ridge, where the family had gathered for 3 generations. When Sarah arrived, she found 75-year-old Eleanor sitting under a shade arbor covered in wisteria, holding a thick leather folder and wearing her thin silver reading glasses on the tip of her nose. Eleanor had built the family business alongside her late husband, starting back when Oak Ridge was just beginning its regional expansion. Even though she had officially stepped down from day-to-day operations years ago, everyone in the family knew that major decisions still had to pass across her desk. Eleanor closed her file, poured iced tea for both of them, and talked for a few minutes about the weather and the garden before asking a question that caught Sarah completely off guard. "Tell me something, Sarah," Eleanor said, looking out over the green lawn. "If someone tried to take something you spent years building, what would you do?" Sarah looked at her mother-in-law. For a second, she wondered if Eleanor already knew about Savannah, but Eleanor's face was smooth, showing nothing. "It depends on what we're talking about," Sarah said carefully, "and whether it's still worth holding on to." Eleanor gave a very small smile. "What if it's your place in this family?" Sarah looked down at her glass. The image of the hotel receipt was right there in her mind. She could have dropped Natalia's name right then, asked Eleanor for advice, or tried to figure out how much the old woman had guessed. But she knew that doing so would turn her personal heartbreak into a corporate family negotiation. "If I have to beg a man to keep my place beside him," Sarah said quietly, "then that place doesn't really belong to me anymore, does it?" Eleanor stopped stirring her tea. "So you wouldn't fight for it?" "I'd fight for my dignity," Sarah replied. "I won't fight to force someone to act like he cares about me." Eleanor stared at her for a long time, then quietly changed the subject to the upcoming summer board meeting. What Sarah didn't know was that Eleanor had known about Natalia Cruz for nearly a month. It was Julian Moreno, a 60-year-old head of site maintenance who had worked for the Vance family for nearly 3 decades, who had quietly brought it up to Eleanor after a trip to coastal Georgia. Julian was not a man given to gossip, but he had seen Arthur leaving a high-end restaurant in Savannah with a young woman late at night. He reported it directly to Eleanor because he worried Arthur's personal choices were going to compromise the family business. Since then, the old woman had been watching her grandson in absolute silence, hoping he would have the sense and the decency to end the mess on his own. He didn't end it. Instead, over the next 4 weeks, Natalia Cruz began appearing in places where Sarah used to be. Natalia was 31, bright, sharp, and ambitious. She worked as a public relations consultant for a regional development firm that frequently partnered with the Vance Group. Her presence alongside Arthur always came with a convenient professional explanation. She was managing corporate messaging, she was introducing Arthur to new regional investors, she was handling local media strategy. But those excuses began to look thin when Natalia turned up at a private dinner at a golf club in Nashville where she had no contractual business, and then accompanied Arthur to a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a commercial center in Chattanooga. The local business papers published photographs from the ceremony the following morning. Sarah saw them on her phone while waiting in the lobby of a medical clinic, where her mother was undergoing routine tests for her heart. In one photo, Natalia was standing close behind Arthur, her hand resting naturally near his shoulder. In another, Arthur was leaning down, whispering something into her ear while she laughed. There was nothing in the photos that proved anything illegal or scandalous on paper, but to Sarah, who had already held the Savannah receipt in her own hands, those images proved something much worse. Arthur no longer felt any need to hide what he was doing. When he returned home that night, Sarah met him in the hallway. He was standing in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie. "I have the annual Vance Foundation Gala tonight," Arthur said, not looking at her through the mirror. I figured you'd want to stay home with your mother since she had that doctor's appointment today. Sarah's eyebrows came together slightly. The foundation gala wasn't scheduled for tonight. It was set for Thursday evening. Arthur caught his own mistake in the mirror reflection and quickly corrected himself, claiming it was a pre-gala dinner with regional donors. Sarah watched his eyes shift. The terrifying thing wasn't just that he was lying. It was that lying to her had become so second nature to him that he couldn't even keep his stories straight anymore. "I hope the dinner goes well," Sarah said softly. Arthur picked up his coat and leaned in to kiss her cheek, an automatic, rehearsed gesture that had meant affection 5 years ago, but now felt like a stamp on a piece of mail. Sarah pulled back just an inch, enough that his lips only brushed the edge of her hair. Arthur paused, looking at her with a sudden flicker of suspicion. For the first time, it crossed his mind that she might know something. Natalia, meanwhile, read Sarah's silence in a completely different way. To Natalia, Sarah wasn't staying silent out of self-respect. She was staying silent out of fear. Natalia had met Arthur during a regional real estate conference 6 months prior, and she quickly picked up on how cold his marriage had become. Arthur complained to her that Sarah had lost her ambition, that she spent all her time taking care of her aging mother or pottering around the house instead of standing beside him as he took control of the family firm. Natalia listened, offered sympathy, and then showed him the exact opposite. High energy, admiration for his business moves, and a willingness to travel at a moment's notice. Slowly, Arthur started repeating a phrase that Natalia loved to hear. "Everything is just so much easier with you." Those words weren't a proposal, but Natalia treated them like one. The more time she spent with Arthur, the less she wanted to be the secret woman hidden away in hotel suites. She wanted the life that came with the Vance name, and she convinced herself that Sarah was simply occupying a space she no longer deserved. One evening, in a high-rise apartment Arthur had leased in downtown Knoxville under a subsidiary company's name, Natalia brought the issue up directly. "How long do you plan on living 2 different lives?" she asked, setting 2 glasses of bourbon on the kitchen counter. Arthur took his glass. "It's complicated, Natalia. My family isn't like other families. You can't just drop a divorce on them without planning every detail." "Is it your family you're worried about?" Natalia asked, leaning against the counter. "Or is it Sarah?" "My grandmother, mostly," Arthur said, turning his glass in his hands. "She has very old-fashioned ideas about marriage and responsibility." Natalia smiled, a cold little curve of her lips. "Then start getting them used to seeing me." Arthur looked at her. A thought that would have alarmed him 3 months ago suddenly felt like an actual strategy. If Natalia gradually became a familiar face in his public circle, the end of his marriage to Sarah wouldn't feel like a sudden shock to the board. It would just look like an inevitable change. His chance came with the Vance Foundation Gala. For 6 years, Sarah had sat beside Arthur at the head table. She knew the names of every major donor, remembered who had grandchildren in college, and quietly smoothed over seating conflicts without ever asking for credit. But this year, Arthur called the foundation director directly and told her that Sarah wouldn't be attending due to her mother's health. He instructed the staff to put Natalia Cruz's name on the place card next to his. The director hesitated. "Mr. Vance, Mrs. Eleanor already approved the seating layout yesterday morning." "Change it," Arthur said flatly. "I'll handle my grandmother." When Eleanor arrived at the downtown hotel ballroom and saw Natalia sitting right where Sarah belonged, she didn't throw a scene. She simply stood near the entrance, her dark eyes tracking Natalia's bright red dress, watching as the younger woman greeted board members as if she already owned a stake in the enterprise. Eleanor realized right then that Arthur's little side project was no longer a private mistake. It was an open challenge to the family's standards. Sarah learned about the gala from Clara, her former co-worker from the design firm. Clara called her the next morning, assuming Sarah and Arthur had already quietly separated. "Sarah, honey, I am so sorry if I'm sticking my nose where it doesn't belong," Clara said, her voice full of hesitation over the phone line. "But last night at the foundation event, Natalia Cruz was sitting in your seat right next to Arthur. People were whispering about it all evening." Sarah closed her eyes. She was standing in her mother's kitchen, holding a bottle of heart medication. "Thank you for telling me, Clara." "Are you okay?" Clara asked after a long pause. "I'm fine." "Sarah, I've known you for 8 years," Clara said gently. "You don't have to pretend with me." Sarah had to hold on to the edge of the kitchen counter to keep her breath steady. "I'm not pretending it doesn't hurt," she whispered. "I'm just trying to decide what to do with the hurt." That same night, when Arthur walked into the house around 9 o'clock, he found Sarah sitting in the living room with a stack of old architectural portfolios across her knees. They were floor plans and material boards from her early days at the design firm. Arthur set his truck keys on the side table and looked at the papers with a slight frown. "What are those for?" "I'm thinking about going back to work with Clara," Sarah said calmly. Arthur's reaction was almost instant. "Now? With everything we've got going on right now, you want to start over from scratch?" Sarah looked up. The phrase "everything we've got going on" sounded almost funny, coming from a man who had just spent the evening parading another woman in front of half the Knoxville business community. "I'm not starting from scratch, Arthur," she said. "I stepped away from a career. I didn't forget how to do my job." Arthur loosened his tie, his expression darkening. "It's a bad time, Sarah. Maybe it's the best time." He wanted to ask what she meant by that, but his phone buzzed in his pocket. Sarah watched his face change for a fraction of a second as he looked at the screen. She didn't need to look over his shoulder to know whose name was on the display. 2 weeks later, Arthur came home early in the middle of the afternoon. He carried a gray leather folder under his arm and spoke in a tight, professional voice that felt like he was delivering a quarterly report to a group of bankers. He asked Sarah to sit down in the home office. "I think we both know this isn't working anymore," Arthur said, sliding 3 printed pages across the desk toward her. Sarah looked down at the top page. It was a private separation agreement. Arthur had built what looked like a very generous exit package. It offered her a newly renovated townhouse in West Knoxville, a lump sum of $200,000, and a monthly allowance for 2 years. But then Sarah's eyes hit the 3rd paragraph, the clause that actually mattered to Arthur. The agreement required Sarah to sign a statement declaring that the marriage was ending due to irreconcilable personal differences, accompanied by a strict non-disclosure clause prohibiting her from making any public statements that could affect Arthur's reputation, the Vance Group, or any third parties associated with the firm. Natalia wasn't mentioned by name, but her shadow was across every word on the page. "You're trying to buy my silence," Sarah said, setting the paper down. Arthur let out an impatient sigh. "Don't be dramatic, Sarah. I'm trying to make sure you're taken care of so we can both move on without a big public mess." "Taken care of?" Sarah looked him straight in the eye. "Arthur, you've been taking Natalia to coastal resorts for months. You sat her in my chair at a charity gala, and now you want me to sign a document saying we just grew apart so you can look like an honorable businessman who simply had a quiet split." Arthur lost the color in his face. He didn't ask how she knew about Savannah. The look on his face confirmed everything. "So, you've been tracking me?" he said, his voice dropping an octave. "I didn't have to track you," Sarah said quietly. You left a resort invoice in your navy blazer pocket. Arthur stood up from the desk, pacing over toward the window. So you've known for months and just sat there playing house? I wasn't playing house. I was waiting. Waiting for what? To see if you'd ever have the courage to tell me the truth before you asked me to sign a piece of paper lying for you. The silence in the room was heavier than any shout. Arthur stared out at the yard, trying to regain his composure. Natalia has nothing to do with the financial terms in that document. She has everything to do with why you handed it to me, Sarah said. I'm not going to sign a legal lie just so you can walk around town looking like a gentleman. Arthur turned back to her, his eyes cold. My last name is still your last name as long as we're married. If you drag this out into a public scandal, you're only going to embarrass yourself. Sarah felt the last piece of her old life break away inside her. For 6 years, she had believed that whatever Arthur's flaws were, he would never use his family's weight to threaten her. She stood up, gathered the 3 pages, and slid them back across the wood toward him. You can leave me, Arthur, she said, her voice completely steady. You can file for divorce, and you can marry Natalia tomorrow if that's what you want. But I am not going to sign a document that turns your betrayal into my shared responsibility. Arthur grabbed the folder, his knuckles turning white. You're making this 10 times harder on yourself out of pure pride. No, Sarah said. I'm just making sure I don't spend the rest of my life feeling ashamed of who I was when you walked out. He left the office without saying another word, and that night he didn't come back to the main bedroom. The next morning, Sarah woke up early, packed her personal drawings into 2 leather cases, and called Clara. Is that kitchen redesign project in Maryville still open? Sarah asked. It sure is, Clara replied instantly. When can you start? This morning. That small decision didn't fix her marriage, and it didn't take away the cold sting of what Arthur had done. But it gave Sarah something she hadn't felt in 6 years, the feeling that her life belonged to her again. Later that afternoon, as she was sitting at a work table in Clara's studio reviewing cabinet samples, her phone rang. It was Eleanor Vance again. The old woman didn't mention the gala, she didn't mention Natalia, and she didn't mention the separation papers. She simply asked if Sarah was planning to attend the monthly family dinner coming up on Sunday evening. Sarah hesitated. Eleanor, I'm not sure it's appropriate for me to be there right now. You are still a member of this family until you decide otherwise, Eleanor said firmly over the line. I expect to see you at 8 o'clock. Sarah accepted the invitation, unaware that across town, Arthur was making a promise of his own. Sitting across from Natalia at a steakhouse near the river, Arthur assured her that the separation was moving forward, regardless of whether Sarah signed the initial agreement. Natalia cut her steak, her eyes fixed on him. I don't want to keep sitting at side tables, Arthur. If your family is going to accept this, they need to start now. Arthur took a drink of his bourbon, thinking about his grandmother's monthly dinner. It was a strict family tradition, held at the old house in Oak Ridge, where no outside guests were usually brought unless they were long-term spouses or engaged to be married. A voice in the back of his mind told him it was a terrible risk, but his pride, still stinging from Sarah's refusal to sign the papers, pushed him forward. Come with me on Sunday, Arthur said. Natalia looked up, surprised. To your grandmother's house? Yes. It's time everybody understood that things have changed. By Friday morning, Eleanor had already begun making her own preparations. She called the family lawyer, Mateo Salazar, into her office at the estate. She also met with Mrs. Martha Jennings, the head housekeeper who had managed the Oak Ridge house for 25 years. Martha, Eleanor said, looking over the grand dining table that could seat 18 people. Set the table for Sunday dinner exactly as you have for the past 6 years. Arthur sits at the middle on the right. Sarah sits directly to his right. Martha paused, holding her notepad. Mrs. Vance, Mr. Arthur called the kitchen staff an hour ago and said there would be an extra guest attending with him. Eleanor didn't look up from her papers. Place an extra chair down near the kitchen entrance, across from Robert. And if Mr. Arthur moves the place cards when he arrives? Martha asked carefully. Eleanor smiled, a cold, quiet movement of her lips. If my grandson wants to move a chair, Martha, let him move it. If he wants to swap a place card, let him swap it. Do not argue with him. Then why are we setting it correctly in the first place, ma'am? Because, Eleanor said softly, I want to see if he has the nerve to destroy the order of this house with his own hands. Sunday evening arrived with a heavy summer storm rolling over the mountains, bringing dark clouds and cool rain that washed over the long driveway of the Vance estate. Arthur and Natalia arrived first, stepping out of Arthur's truck under a large black umbrella. Natalia was dressed in an elegant cream-colored silk dress, wearing simple gold jewelry, carefully styled to look refined rather than flashy. She greeted Eleanor in the front hallway with a warm smile, stepping forward to kiss the old woman's cheek before Eleanor had even offered her hand. "Thank you so much for having me, Mrs. Vance," Natalia said smoothly. "Arthur has told me so much about these Sunday dinners." Eleanor looked at her for 2 long seconds. "I'm sure he has," she said dryly. Arthur moved in quickly, introducing Natalia to his uncles and cousins as they came down the grand staircase. Some of them shook her hand with polite, guarded smiles. Others exchanged quick, knowing looks. But nobody raised an eyebrow openly. That initial silence gave Natalia a dangerous surge of confidence. She began to believe her own strategy was working. If nobody complained, it meant they were all going to adjust to her presence sooner or later. 20 minutes before dinner was served, Arthur walked into the empty dining room. He saw the place cards laid out on the white linen tablecloth. His name was sitting right in the middle on the right side. Directly beside him was the card bearing Sarah's name, in fine calligraphy. Down near the far end of the table, close to the kitchen swinging door, sat a lone extra chair with Natalia's name on a blank white card. Arthur picked up Sarah's place card and called out to Martha, who was setting down water glasses. "Put Natalia's card here beside me," Arthur ordered. Martha stopped, her hands tightening around the silver water pitcher. "Mr. Vance, Mrs. Eleanor personally signed off on this seating arrangement." "I am changing it," Arthur said, swapping the cards himself. "Put Sarah down at the end." Martha looked at the card in her hand, then at Arthur's face. Remembering Eleanor's strict instructions, she didn't argue. She quietly walked down to the end of the table and placed Sarah's card on the small folding chair near the kitchen entrance. Natalia walked into the dining room a moment later, holding a glass of white wine. She saw what Arthur had done and smiled, walking over to touch his arm. But then her eyes fell on the place setting beside him. Lying on the polished plate was a heavy, hand-embroidered cloth napkin featuring a dark navy S, Sarah's personal napkin, which had been kept in the sideboard for years alongside the other family initials. "You should probably have them swap that out too," Natalia said softly, pointing at the embroidered letter. Arthur reached out to grab the napkin, but Martha spoke from the doorway. "Mrs. Vance specifically requested that napkin remain at that setting, sir." Arthur's hand paused over the cloth. He looked at Natalia, whose smile had faltered slightly. "Leave it," Arthur said, stepping back. "It's just a piece of cloth. It doesn't mean anything." Natalia touched the embroidered thread with the tip of her finger. "Of course not," she murmured. "It's just a napkin." From the dark hallway outside the dining room doors, Eleanor had watched the entire exchange through the half-open door. She saw her grandson move his wife's name to the foot of the table. She saw him seat his mistress in her place, and she saw him let another woman handle a family keepsake. She didn't utter a word. She simply turned around, walked back to the living room, and waited. Sarah arrived 12 minutes late. The conversation in the living room died down the moment she stepped through the front door. She had wore a simple, dark blue dress, her hair pulled back neatly, wearing no jewelry other than a silver watch her mother had given her years ago. She looked tired around the eyes, but her posture was straight, and her step was firm. "You're late," Arthur said, stepping forward from the fireplace where he was standing with Natalia. Sarah looked at her watch. 12 minutes, Arthur. My mother needed help with her evening medications. Natalia offered a polite, practiced smile from beside him. I hope your mother is doing better, Sarah. She's managing, thank you, Sarah replied, her tone entirely polite and entirely distant. Eleanor walked across the rug, took Sarah by both hands, and kissed her warmly on the forehead. It was a tiny gesture, but everyone in the room noticed it. Arthur shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Natalia's smile tightened just a fraction. I'm so glad you made it, sweetheart, Eleanor said gently. I wouldn't miss it, Eleanor, Sarah replied. When Martha announced that dinner was served, the family began moving toward the dining room. Arthur walked beside Natalia, his hand resting firmly on the small of her back. Sarah walked a few steps behind them, beside Eleanor and Uncle Robert. As they entered the dining room, Sarah saw the arrangement immediately. She saw Natalia taking her seat directly to Arthur's right, smoothing her cream silk dress as she sat down. She saw her own name card placed on the small folding chair down at the far end of the table, right beside the swinging door where the kitchen staff carried out the tray of hot dishes. And she saw Natalia pick up the embroidered napkin with the navy S, unfold it, and place it across her silk lap. For 3 seconds, Sarah felt like all the air had been sucked out of her lungs. It wasn't just that she had been moved, it was the deliberate, calculated nature of the humiliation. Arthur hadn't just brought his mistress to a family dinner. He had constructed a public demonstration to show everyone in his family that Sarah had been replaced, demoted, and pushed to the margins of the house she had helped care for. Martha stood by the kitchen door, her face pale with embarrassment, pointing toward the end chair. Mrs. Sarah, your place is down here tonight. Arthur watched Sarah closely, waiting for the crack in her composure. He expected her to refuse to sit, to demand an explanation, or to turn around and leave the house in tears. Instead, Sarah took a quiet breath, walked down the length of the long mahogany table, and pulled out the small folding chair. Thank you, Martha, Sarah said, her voice clear enough for the entire room to hear. This is just fine. Natalia looked down at her plate, unable to hide a quick smirk. Arthur let out a slow breath, settling into his chair with a look of absolute triumph. He believed he had won. He believed he had forced his entire family, and his wife, to accept the new reality without a single yell or scene. At the head of the table, Eleanor Vance sat down slowly. She didn't touch her silver fork. She didn't reach for her napkin. She looked at her grandson sitting in the middle of the table. She looked at Natalia adjusting her gold bracelet. And then she looked all the way down to the end of the room, where Sarah sat alone by the kitchen door. Eleanor raised her water glass, took one small sip, and set it down on the table with a firm, heavy clack. The first course was served in an uncomfortable silence that hung over the room like heavy fog. The family members chewed their salad, keeping their eyes glued to their plates, avoiding eye contact with Sarah down at the foot of the table. Natalia, feeling more confident by the minute, turned toward Eleanor. "Mrs. Vance," Natalia began, her tone bright and engaging, "Arthur was telling me earlier this week about how long this estate has been in the family. It must take an extraordinary amount of effort to maintain traditions like this." Eleanor looked up. "Some traditions are worth maintaining, Miss Cruz. Others only last as long as the people keeping them remember who they are." Natalia smiled, missing the edge in the old woman's words. "Of course. Arthur and I were actually discussing some ideas for updating the house a bit. With all this dark wood, a few lighter drapes and some modern lighting fixtures would really open up the space." Across the table, Uncle Robert cleared his throat loudly. "Sarah handled the interior restoration of this house 5 years ago, Miss Cruz. She spent 6 months matching the original woodwork." Arthur didn't look at Sarah. "Well, that was 5 years ago, Uncle Robert. Natalia has a very sharp eye for modern corporate aesthetics. She's been giving me great input on our regional office spaces, too." The word was hit Sarah with a quiet, dull ache. It was Arthur's way of framing her entire existence in the past tense. She was an designer. She was his wife. She was part of the family. "Actually," Sarah spoke up from the end of the table, her voice steady and clear, "I've started taking on new projects again. I'm partnering with Clara's studio on a historical renovation downtown." 2 of Arthur's cousins smiled and offered quick congratulations. Eleanor nodded her approval. Arthur's jaw tightened. He looked down the table at Sarah, clearly irritated that she had brought up her independent work in front of the family. "That's wonderful, Sarah," Natalia said, her voice dipping into a tone of soft condescension. "It's always good to have a small project to keep yourself busy during transition periods like this." Sarah looked at Natalia from across the length of the room. "It's not to keep myself busy, Natalia. It's to resume a life I should have never put on hold." Natalia picked up her wineglass, her smile weakening slightly. "Well, I certainly meant no offense." "None taken," Sarah said quietly. As the main course was brought out, Natalia continued to talk, moving from home design to travel plans. "Arthur and I are hoping to take a long weekend down in coastal Florida next month," Natalia said, leaning slightly into Arthur's shoulder. "Once all these private family matters finally get settled, of course." The statement dropped into the middle of the room like a stone. Once all these private family matters get settled. It wasn't a professional comment. It was a public declaration that she was waiting for the divorce to go through so she could take Sarah's place permanently. Eleanor set her knife down. "And what, exactly, needs to be settled, Miss Cruz?" Natalia hesitated, realizing she might have stepped across an invisible line. Arthur spoke up quickly, his voice tight. "Grandma, let's not do this here. Sarah and I are going through a legal separation. Natalia is a part of my life now, and I'm not going to keep hiding it." It was the first time he had said it out loud to the entire family. Eleanor didn't flinch. "A legal separation? As far as the law and this family are concerned, Arthur, you are fully married to the woman sitting by the kitchen door." Arthur's face flushed dark red. "Sarah is refusing to sign the separation agreement, Grandma. She's dragging her feet out of pure spite." The family went dead silent. Nobody expected Arthur to bring up the legal fight right there over dinner. Sarah looked straight at Arthur. "I am not refusing to sign a divorce, Arthur. I am refusing to sign your agreement, which requires me to lie and state that you didn't spend 6 months sleeping with another woman while using corporate funds to cover the hotel receipts." A collective gasp went around the table. Uncle Robert set his fork down with a loud clatter. Arthur stood halfway up out of his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the table. You have no right to bring corporate matters into this. You brought corporate matters into this the second you put your mistress on a company expense account, Arthur, Eleanor said, her voice dropping into a register so cold it cut through the room like a blade. Arthur turned toward his grandmother, his chest heaving. What are you talking about? Eleanor didn't answer him directly. She raised her hand and signaled to Martha, who was standing by the sideboard. Martha stepped forward, carrying a thick black leather binder, and laid it quietly on the table right next to Eleanor's plate. Over the past 3 weeks, Eleanor said, opening the folder, I had our chief financial officer conduct an independent review of the discretionary expenditure accounts for the regional division. Arthur's eyes went wide. The anger on his face suddenly turned into something that looked very much like panic. Eleanor turned a page. Item 1. 4 nights at a resort in Savannah, Georgia. Billed as a regional broker summit. 2 guests listed. Item 2. 2 first-class airline tickets to Miami. Billed under client entertainment. Item 3. A $3,000 charge at a high-end jewelry store in Nashville, listed as an institutional gift. Natalia's hand went instinctively to the heavy gold bracelet resting against her wrist. She looked at Arthur, her eyes wide with shock. Arthur, you told me you bought this with your own money. Arthur couldn't answer her. He looked at his grandmother, then at his uncle, then at the corporate lawyer sitting 3 seats down, who was currently staring at the table with a look of severe professional concern. And finally, Eleanor continued, her voice entirely flat, a lease agreement for an apartment in downtown Knoxville, paid through a shell holding company registered under the Vance Group's logistics division. Eleanor closed the binder with a soft, heavy thud. You didn't just betray your wife, Arthur, Eleanor said, looking her grandson directly in the eye. You used family assets, money built by your grandfather's sweat, to finance your deceit because you were arrogant enough to believe nobody would ever check your work. Natalia stood up from her chair so fast her wineglass tipped over, spilling red wine across the white tablecloth and pooling near the embroidered Navy S on Sarah's napkin. Is this true? Natalia asked, her voice shaking with rage as she looked down at Arthur. You put my apartment on a company account? Natalia, sit down. We can talk about this later. Arthur tried to say. No! Natalia snapped, her polished professional exterior completely shattering in front of the entire family. You told me you were a senior partner. You told me you owned those assets outright. You made me look like an accomplice to corporate fraud. She grabbed her leather purse from the floor, her face burning red with deep embarrassment. She looked down at Sarah, then at Eleanor, and finally back at Arthur. I am getting a cab, Natalia said, her voice tight and humiliated. Don't you dare call me tomorrow. She turned on her heel and walked out of the dining room, her high heels clicking loudly against the hardwood hallway until the front door slammed shut behind her. The silence that followed was absolute. Arthur stood beside his chair, looking around the table at his family. His uncle wouldn't look at him. His cousins were staring at their plates. The corporate lawyer was making quick notes on a pad of paper. And his grandmother was sitting perfectly still at the head of the table. Finally, Arthur turned his eyes down toward the end of the room. Sarah was still sitting in the folding chair near the kitchen door. She didn't look triumphant. She didn't look happy. She just looked at him with a profound, quiet sadness. The look of a woman who was watching a man she used to love reveal every small, desperate corner of his real character. Are you happy now, Sarah? Arthur whispered, his voice bitter and broken. You destroyed everything. Sarah looked at him for 5 long seconds before she spoke. I didn't book those rooms, Arthur, Sarah said softly. I didn't bring Natalia to this house, And I didn't move my own chair down to the kitchen door. You made every single one of those choices yourself. I just stopped lying to help you hide them." Arthur swallowed hard, but he couldn't find a single word to say back. He grabbed his coat from the back of his chair, turned away from the table, and walked out into the rain. The storm outside had settled into a quiet, steady rain by the time dinner officially ended. Eleanor walked Sarah out to her car near the front steps of the estate. The old woman looked tired, the lines around her eyes deeper than they had been 3 hours ago, but her hand was steady as she rested it on Sarah's arm. "I'm sorry you had to go through that in my home, Sarah," Eleanor said softly. "You don't have to apologize, Eleanor," Sarah replied, pulling her coat around her shoulders. "You gave me back my self-respect tonight." "Your self-respect was never missing, child," Eleanor said gently. "You just needed to see that the rest of us saw it too." 2 weeks later, the divorce papers were finalized. Sarah didn't ask for the townhouse in West Knoxville, nor did she ask for a monthly allowance. She took her fair half of the savings they had built together during their 6 years, her personal belongings, and the small sports car her father had left her when he passed away. When she signed her name on the final page in the lawyer's office, she didn't write Sarah Vance. She signed it simply, Sarah Ferrer. Arthur was officially removed from his position as prospective executive director of the Vance Group the following month, placed under strict corporate oversight by his uncle and the board until the full financial audit was completed. The apartment in downtown Knoxville was relinquished, and Natalia Cruz moved back to Atlanta to take a position with another firm, her relationship with Arthur completely severed. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Sarah stood in the lobby of a newly restored historic hotel in downtown Knoxville. The exposed brick walls glowed under warm light. The original heart pine floors had been brought back to their deep amber luster, and the custom furniture, designed specifically for the space, fitted the historical character of the building perfectly. Local journalists, business leaders, and city representatives were milling around the lobby with glasses of champagne, celebrating the grand opening of the building. Clara came up behind Sarah, slipping an arm around her waist, and handed her a glass of sparkling water. "Look at that," Clara whispered, pointing toward a small polished brass plaque mounted on the wall near the front desk. Sarah looked over. The plaque read, "Interior Design and Historical Restoration by Sarah Ferrer, not Mrs. Arthur Vance, not the Vance Group. Just her name, standing on its own, grounded in her own work and her own talent." Sarah smiled, taking a slow sip of her water. A few minutes later, the main doors of the hotel opened, and an old lady holding a dark wooden walking cane stepped into the lobby, accompanied by a driver. Eleanor Vance looked around the room, taking in the high ceilings, the warm lighting, and the beautiful woodwork, before her eyes found Sarah. Sarah walked over quickly to meet her. "Eleanor, I didn't know you were coming today." "I wouldn't miss it for the world," Eleanor said, looking around the grand space with deep approval. "You built something truly beautiful here, Sarah." "Thank you," Sarah said softly. Eleanor looked at the brass plaque on the brick wall, then turned back to Sarah, taking both of her hands in her own. "You know," Eleanor said, her voice warm and steady, "for a long time, I thought that keeping a family together meant holding on to people no matter what they did to each other. But I was wrong. A real life isn't built by clinging to a chair at a table where you're no longer respected. It's built by having the courage to stand up, walk out the door, and build a table of your own." Sarah looked at the old woman, feeling a quiet warmth spread through her chest, a feeling that had nothing to do with anger or regret, and everything to do with peace. Life has a way of testing us, not in the moments when everything is going well, but in the quiet, painful spaces where we have to decide what we are willing to tolerate. Many of us spend years building lives, marriages, and careers, pouring our time, energy, and youth into foundation stones that we hope will stand forever. We compromise, we adjust, we step back into the shadows to let others shine, and we tell ourselves that sacrifice is simply the price of love and family loyalty. But there is a vast difference between healthy sacrifice and self-erasure. When someone continuously moves your place to the end of the table, whether through small disrespects in private or quiet betrayals in public, they are showing you exactly how much they value your presence. Trying to force a seat at a table where your dignity is the cost of admission is a battle you will always lose, even if you manage to stay in the chair. True strength does not lie in enduring endless indignities just to keep a title, a house, or an old memory alive. True strength lies in the quiet, unshakable realization that your worth was never given to you by another person, and therefore cannot be taken away by them either. Walking away from a dishonest situation is rarely easy, especially when you have invested 6, 10, or 20 years of your life into it. It hurts to realize that the person you cared for may never become the person you hoped they would be. It hurts to leave behind the comfort of familiar rooms, shared histories, and the quiet security of a routine. But the temporary grief of walking away is nothing compared to the long, slow loss of losing yourself to someone else's disrespect. As we grow older, we come to understand that dignity is not about pride, revenge, or winning an argument. Dignity is simply the quiet boundary that says, I love myself too much to stay where I am diminished. When you step away from places that require you to shrink, you don't lose your seat in the world. You simply make room for a real life to begin.